CJ Flyer back with another YouTube video. Today teaching you how to set up a fantasy draft in Madden 26 franchise mode. To get started, from the main menu, select franchise, then select create new league. Next, if you're playing single player and don't plan to use team builder or simulate multiple weeks in a row, I highly suggest selecting play offline. Otherwise, if you're planning to play multiplayer online with friends, use team builder, or simulate often, you should consider selecting play online. For this example, I'll create an offline franchise save file. Next, click the rosters you'd like to use. In this example, I'll use the preseason week 1 rosters. Next, select the team you wish to use. Of course, since it's a fantasy draft, the player summary and team ratings you see on the right is irrelevant. In this example, I'll be selecting the Indianapolis Colts. Next, choose whether you'd like to start with a custom coach or the existing real-life NFL head coach. Now you should be in the customization screen. This is where you can choose the starting point for your franchise as well as adjusting league settings. First, you'll want to select starting point and then select fantasy draft. Now before you get too excited and click to start playing, I recommend selecting league settings and then scrolling down to draft timer. If you're playing a single player offline franchise, I highly recommend turning the draft timer off. Leaving it on will allow you only 90 seconds to draft a player each round. That being said, you are still able to pause the draft timer if you leave this setting on by selecting pause draft at any time during the fantasy draft. However, I do recommend leaving the draft timer setting on for an online multiplayer fantasy draft franchise just to keep the draft moving along and not waiting on any one player for several minutes to decide on a draft pick. Another draft setting to consider is the fantasy draft order. Standard fantasy draft order will maintain the same draft order for each round, while the snake fantasy draft order will reverse the draft order for each round, meaning that if you were the last pick of the first round, you would then be the first pick of the second round. In either scenario, the draft order is always randomized and you are unfortunately not able to manually adjust the draft order yourself. Once you've set your fantasy draft settings in addition to the other league settings that you wish to adjust, go back to the customization screen and click to start playing. You will then be brought to the franchise home submenu where you can click to start the draft when ready. You will immediately enter a draft selection menu screen with a randomized draft order and all teams' first round picks prior to yours already simulated. From here, you can select make your selection and choose the player you wish to draft. You can filter by position, holding R2 on the PlayStation 5 or the right trigger on the Xbox Series X or S and navigating through the list of positions. You can also sort players by various metrics, including overall grade, last name, age, speed, and strength, by holding triangle on the PlayStation 5 or Y on the Xbox Series X or S and navigating through the list of metrics. Keep in mind that at the time of recording this video, it appears that the sort by development trait feature is glitched as the list of players is not being sorted properly. Right now, as you can see on screen, Caleb Williams has the Superstar X Factor dev trait and he should be at the top of this list. However, we are seeing other quarterbacks appearing before him in this dev trait sorted list. Lastly, you can click L2 on the PlayStation 5 or the left trigger on the Xbox Series X or S to view players you drafted in previous rounds. You unfortunately cannot view a list of players drafted by other teams in previous rounds. The only way you can see players that were drafted by other teams in previous rounds or during the current round is you see the little visual graphic as you are about to make your selection in the background. And if you take a close look, you can see which players were drafted by all teams prior to your pick in the given round. At any time during the draft, you can select skip ahead in the draft and choose to either advance to the next user pick or simulate to the end of the draft. Keep in mind that this means the CPU GM will handle drafting for you, which may result in undesirable draft picks. Once the draft is over, you can proceed as normal with your franchise mode starting in preseason week 1, just as you would without having done a fantasy draft. Some general tips for fantasy drafts in Madden 26. All elite quarterbacks are gone in the first half of the first round when you're going up against other teams controlled by the CPU. As you can see in this example here, 8 of the top 10 picks were all quarterbacks. And you'll see that even the above average and younger quarterbacks continue to be drafted before elite players at other positions. Here's another example. We're in round 3 and you can see Sam Darnold got picked before Saquon Barkley in round 3. Barkley, of course, being a 99 overall running back, the highest rating running back in Madden 26. The best defensive edge, cornerbacks, linebackers, and wide receivers also tend to get picked in the first 2 to 3 rounds. And by round 4, the remaining quarterbacks will typically only have the normal development trait. So, if you want to have a decent starting quarterback for your fantasy draft franchise mode, I highly recommend going after an above average or good quarterback within the first 2 to 3 rounds before they're all taken by the CPU teams. Otherwise, if you want your focus to be more on the running game, then this works out perfectly, as the CPU, like I said, tends to favor going after quarterbacks early on and not so much the running backs or the offensive linemen. Of course, in an online fantasy draft with other users, things might play out differently, but these are just general tips for playing against the CPU in a single player fantasy draft franchise mode. Leave a comment below if you have any further questions regarding setting up a fantasy draft, and click one of the videos on your screen now for some more Madden 26 tutorials.